Hello, everyone. Happy Women's History Month, and welcome to the release of United We's National Civic Engagement Research. I'm Wendy Doyle, President and CEO of United We. To further get to know one another, please, as you are joining us, drop your name, the organization that you represent in the chat as an opportunity to introduce one another. Also, throughout the presentation, if you think of a question, feel comfortable in dropping it in the chat. We'll have some time at the end of the research information for answering questions. We are here today to announce findings from the first national study of its kind about women's representation on local appointed boards and commissions. To understand and take necessary steps to create greater balance and gender equity on local appointed boards and commissions, United We commissioned new research to collect data and analyze women's participation in cities across the United States. Today, we will share the findings, why it matters, and what you can do. Before we dive into the research, let me tell you a little bit more about United We and introduce our guest speakers. At United We, our mission is to advance all women's economic and civic leadership to make meaningful change. We do this through three key initiatives: evidence-based research, advocating for policy reform that positively impacts all women, and supporting the appointment of more women on boards and commissions through our nationwide program, the Appointments Project. Research is at the very core of everything we do. We believe it is the first step to true, sustainable change. It is critical to identify specific barriers to women's economic development and then develop smart, practical solutions to overcome them. In fact, today's National Research Report is part of our United We Institute to assess challenges and advancement in women's economic and civic participation for a greater future. Building off years of robust research, the United We Institute is a first of its kind centralized hub for our research and policy work across the Midwest and beyond. It elevates the voices of women and advances nonpartisan policy solutions. Specifically, the purpose of the Institute is to influence local and state-based policies to advance women in economic and civic leadership. At United we believe all levels of a civic engagement, including boards and commissions, should reflect the rich diversity of the communities they serve. Our research shows that increasing the number of women on civic boards and commissions has a positive impact. When women serve, the results include an increase in public trust in our government, a boost in government efficiency, improvement in the lives of all residents, and it drives innovation. As it is still Women's History Month, now is an opportune time to reveal these research findings that will help us measure our progress as we strive to increase gender balance on boards across the United States. Before we dive into the national study, I want to mention that we've conducted this type of research in Kansas and Missouri. We've looked into municipal gender representation on boards and commissions in Kansas, and that research revealed that Kansas women are underrepresented on civic boards and commissions, especially on what we refer to as power boards that have direct influence on policymaking and financial resource allocation, such as planning and zoning boards. Last year, we announced research conducted by the University of Missouri St. Louis about women's representation and racial diversity on local boards and commissions in Missouri. And interestingly, that research found the boards and commissions in Missouri are not reflective of the racial, ethnic, and gender composition of the state. Both of these studies are available on our website, and I encourage you to review them and learn more at united-we.org. Now, I'd like to highlight our three presenters for today. We have Dr. Amy Jonasson and Dr. Tim Green, the lead authors for the study of this research study, who will be sharing the findings on this important research. Amy is a sociologist with subject matter expertise in civic engagement, urban sociology, and cultural sociology. The common thread in her research is examining how people come together to create effective social change, and her research has been published in several peer-reviewed academic journals. As an applied sociologist at Open Fields, Amy supports organizations in using the research and data to drive strategy and shape national conversations on complex problems. Tim is an experienced researcher and educator focused on local and regional development. At Open Fields, he built and leads a team that designs research, data architectures, and tools that shed light on complex problems. His peer-reviewed research has appeared in publications titled Housing Policy Debate and State and Local Government Review, and he has taught graduate level courses in urban and regional economics, impact modeling, GIS, and research design. As you can see, we've been in good hands with the research team. In addition, we're thrilled to have DePriest Taylor from the Kansas City Current, which just held and won its first soccer match at the world's first purpose-built women's professional sports stadium in the world. So wow, and congratulations. DePriest also serves on the Board of Commissioners for Kansas City, Missouri Parks and Recreation, and she'll be sharing a bit about her civic journey with us. Thank you all for being here, and again, for those who have just joined us, please introduce yourself by dropping your name and the organization you represent in the chat. And as a reminder, if you have questions throughout the presentation, feel comfortable in dropping them in the chat, and we'll get to them at the end of the presentation. Now, I'm going to turn it over to Amy and Tim to share the research results, and then we'll hear from DePriest. Amy and Tim, please take it away.
Thank you, Wendy. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. We're really excited to share the results of the study that we conducted for United We and just move forward this research, asking some really important questions about how well our local appointed boards are reflecting the full diversity of the populations of the towns and cities that they serve. So our report is titled Out of Balance, an assessment of women's representation on local appointed boards. And Dr. Jonason and I were the lead authors, but we also had help from a team of researchers here at Open Fields because it involved a great deal of data collection. As you'll see when we start to describe our data set, we have thousands and thousands of records that we had to amass and code and pour through. So definitely took an entire team to bring this together. Next slide. So I think the first question to put this in context is, why do we study local government? And in addition to the fact that any level of government is relevant to our lives, local government stands out at this particular time in some unique ways in the United States. Trust in government institutions, as I think most people are aware, has been declining. In more recent years, it has been declining somewhat rapidly. And it's fallen to historic lows. But local government is a bit of an exception to that. Local government still has relatively high degrees of trust, and even more surprising in our polarized times, that trust is fairly bipartisan. So local government is still somewhat of a bastion of faith and trust on the part of a lot of people. So for that reason, it seems like a very important part of our society that we should protect and make sure that it's performing and up to the task of what we ask of it. Next slide. So what we're actually looking at and talking about when we talk about representation and gender representation on local appointed boards is what researchers call the need for reflective representation. And essentially, this is just the idea that the people serving in government need to reflect the populations that they serve. And they need to do that so that they can, in fact, represent them. And I think we heard earlier Wendy mention all of the ways in which women's representation on boards is so important and brings so many advantages. But at a very basic level, one way to think about it is, if women are not in these positions, then the lives, the lived experience, the very particular understandings of the world that women have, which are different than men's, not 100%, but they are unique at times, those aren't reflected. And so those opinions, those thoughts, those problems, those concerns don't get the same airing in our government institutions if women are not at the table. So despite some gains in recent years, women are still underrepresented. And so the, excuse me, the graph that you see there is the the representation of women in the two houses of US Congress, the House of Representatives and the Senate. And you see that in the last few decades, there was definitely an improvement after more than a century of having no representation at all. But they still lag behind the proportion of women in the population, which is half. One of the things that we wanted to do with this research was to design a similar graph to show folks what does that look like at the local government scale, and particularly locally appointed boards. And before we conducted this research, as far as we're aware, it wasn't possible for anyone to make that graph on a national scale. So that's what we're hoping to do. Next slide. So just a quick point about why we would study local appointed boards. Most people are familiar with local government. People are familiar with mayors and city councils. Local appointed boards serve a whole host of extremely important functions that help local governments do the jobs that they need to do. People may be familiar with certain kinds of boards and commissions at the federal or at the state level, but those kinds of things are absolutely happening as well at the local level. So most people are familiar with planning and zoning boards, but in some cities there are dozens and dozens of these boards, and they're carrying out all sorts of functions of government. Some of them have control over finance, some of them have control over regulatory decisions, and really it's just not possible to conceive of local government doing the job it does without these boards playing a role. So this is just some recent headlines that we pulled, noting all across the country some of the different kinds of decisions that locally appointed boards and commissions are making. They're involved in decisions about affordable housing. They're involved in decisions about, recently there's been, as most people are probably aware, a real crisis in childcare in this country. Local planning and zoning boards have been implicated as one of the reasons why that's a problem. And so very quickly you can get from locally appointed boards to very big national problems. So these are a really important part of government, and we need to understand whether or not they are in fact representing the people that they are designed to serve. Next slide. So what did we do? Well, we set out to answer the question, which is a fairly straightforward question. What share of seats on local appointed boards are held by women in the United States at this time? And in order to do that, we kind of needed to come up with a research design that would let us gather a set of data that we felt was reasonably representative. There are, of course, thousands, probably tens of thousands of local boards and commissions in the United States. Can't look at all of them. So how did we amass a data set that we felt was national in scope and also fairly representative of local boards and commissions? So the first thing we did is we decided to focus on the two largest cities in every state. That would give us national representation, make sure that we're not skewing too far to one region or another. We picked the two largest because they're prominent. I will say that that data set includes fairly small cities in it in states like Vermont, and also some very large cities like Chicago and New York. Once we had a set of cities to look at, we then wanted to look at boards that were of the same type. And the reason this was important is because prior research has actually shown that different types of boards actually have different levels of representation by gender, and that it's somewhat regular. Now, that hasn't been done nationally, but the Kansas study that United We commissioned, that Wendy mentioned in her introduction, that study found that very much. So we also know that cities don't all have the same kinds of boards. Local government in the United States is very messy. It's largely under the control of the states. And so there's no guarantee from city to city that you would find the same exact set of boards and commissions operating. And so we didn't want to just pull a data set that kind of was, in a sense, pulling then whatever boards were in the particular cities we found. We wanted to develop a consistent set of boards. So we just settled on 4 board types that I'll talk about in a second, and we essentially captured data from all 4 of these board types in these cities. Not every city had all 4 types of boards, and in some cases, some cities have more than one of each individual type. So a city might have a planning and zoning commission, and they also might have a board of appeals. But we captured 4 consistent types of looking across these cities. Sorry, can you back up one second? Then The last two things we did is that we went and using publicly available data, we gathered the data on the names of the current board members that were serving on the boards at the time. And then we used actually a set of algorithms that are based on machine learning that uses those names to predict the gender of the folks on the boards. And Amy will talk about that more in a second. Next slide. So just really quickly, what are the 4 types of boards that we looked at? Well, we looked at 4. The 4 that we looked at were chosen because of their common, the fact that they are very common, the fact that, as Wendy mentioned, some of them are particularly powerful, and one of them is there because we wanted to explore some findings from earlier research. So I'll tell you what they are. The first was the planning and zoning boards, and we chose these because planning and zoning are one of the most powerful functions that is delegated to local government. This is where a lot of local land development decisions are made, and via those development decisions, which are backed, by the full regulatory power of the state, you can have decisions about things as diverse as affordable housing, economic development, all kinds of things like that. So it's just a core function of local government, planning and zoning and land regulation. Second type we looked at was parks and recreation boards. We looked at these because, again, they're actually quite common. Many, not absolutely every, but most cities actually do have these. It's another one of those very common and familiar functions of local government that people are kind of familiar with and aware of. So we chose that one for that. Housing boards, we looked at similar to parks and recreation, not most cities, or many cities, most cities have housing boards dealing with issues of affordable housing, dealing with issues with the provision of sufficient numbers of housing, things like that. And then the last one we looked at was library boards. And the reason we looked at library boards was because that was the one type of board in prior research that had been shown to actually have a balance of women on it. And so we wanted to make sure that we wanted to look at the powerful boards and the really central core functions of city boards. But we wanted to make sure that we were not missing something by only choosing that type. So we put library boards in there as well to try to see if those findings from the Kansas study were actually true at the national scale. Next slide. So as a result, we came up with a data set that consisted of data from 98 cities. Within those 98 cities, we were able to get data for 586 boards across those 4 types. And we pulled together then the membership of those boards, and that yielded a data set of 5,125 people. So while we start from a select set of cities and we're looking at 4 board types, the goal is to get a consistent data set that we feel very confident in, and to do one that was as large enough so that we could draw substantial findings. So that was the data set that we pulled together. And I'm going to turn it over to Amy to talk through the findings and as well as how we did the gender identification.
All right. Thank you, Tim. So of those 5,125 seats that we had data on, about 5% of those were vacant. And for the remaining seats, to determine the gender of the board members in those seats, or at least to predict it, we ran their first names of the board members through 2 different statistical algorithms. These algorithms reference data sets from major social networks in the one case, and in another case, referencing data sets from the Social Security Administration. And they will cross-reference someone's first name with those data sets to predict their gender based on their first name. So when both of the algorithms agreed, and when they both predicted the same gender with a high degree of confidence, we categorized the board member as a man or a woman accordingly. We ultimately collected data on 4,846 names, and the algorithms were able to predict a gender for 94.6% of those. Next slide. So now I'll talk about some of our key findings. First, women occupy only 39% of seats on the local appointed boards in our data set on those 586 boards. Men occupy over 50%. As I mentioned a minute ago, 5% of the seats that we analyzed were vacant. And then there were another 5% that either the algorithms didn't agree or they couldn't predict the gender of the person occupying the seat with a high degree of confidence. So this 39% number, this is the first time that we know of that it's been, we've nationally assessed women's representation on these local appointed boards. But our finding of 39% is comparable to the findings of the few state level studies that we know about that have been conducted. This includes the studies that United We has already commissioned in Kansas and in Missouri. For example, researchers in Missouri found that women make up 37% of all boards. So that's very close to the number that we found nationally. Next slide. Our second major finding is that women's representation varies by board type. And the graphic that you see shows exactly what that distribution of women's representation was across our 4 types. Beginning with planning and zoning boards, we found that women make up just over 1/3 of these boards. Men, by comparison, occupy about 56% of seats on planning and zoning boards across the country. We found that women are also underrepresented on parks and recreation and housing boards, although to a somewhat lesser degree than on the planning and zoning boards. And finally, we found that library boards, as we thought might be the case, are the only type of board on which women make up at least 50% of seats. So with women making up just over half of the United States population, that means that library boards are the one place where we consistently see what we would think of as reflective representation. In fact, women make up almost 57% of seats on library boards. Men are only at 34%. These findings are, again, in line with studies from Kansas and Missouri. Those studies also identified library boards as a type on which women are overrepresented. This is the first assessment that we've done nationally to find that this is consistent across the nation. And interestingly, our analysis shows no regional difference in this pattern. So in the Northeast, the South, the Midwest, and the West, in every region, we see women most underrepresented on planning and zoning boards, and we see them overrepresented on library boards. And then parks and recreation and housing, we see consistent underrepresentation, but not quite to the same degree as we see on the planning and the zoning boards. Next slide. Finally, our research found that underrepresentation is widespread. We didn't just look at the board representation by region. We actually broke out our overall findings by region. And again, in the the Northeast, the South, the Midwest, and the West, we don't see variation in that 39% number. Women are underrepresented in all regions of the country on these local appointed boards. And when we look city by city, the results are much the same. At most, only 21 of those 98 cities meet or exceed a 50% threshold of women-occupied seats. And we say at most, this number is based on some pretty generous assumptions about the seats that our algorithms couldn't predict gender for. So in the best case scenario, we are looking at only 21 out of 98 cities meeting that threshold of what we consider reflective representation. Next slide. So why does this matter? We think it matters for a number of reasons, but ultimately, underrepresentation means that women's experiences aren't being brought to local policymaking conversations to the same degree as men's. Women and men in the United States have different experiences in the workplace, raising children, caregiving for older family members, starting and running businesses, and in a lot of other areas of life. And when women aren't present to give voice to their experiences in spaces where decisions are being made, this can affect the responsiveness of policy and it can undermine trust. And in a time when local government is holding an outsized share of Americans' trust, it is critical that appointed boards better reflect the communities that they serve. Our findings also invite some questions about why we're seeing this pattern, right? The why of underrepresentation. And that's likely complex. We have reason to believe that some of the reasons that affect women's representation in elected office could also apply here. For example, studies on women's representation in elected office have found that women don't seek elected office as often as men because they have more family responsibilities, they have lower confidence in their ability to serve, and they're generally not encouraged or asked to serve. And some research that United We has done, particularly in Kansas City, has supported this when it comes to appointed boards and commissions, finding that women they often cite family responsibilities and not being asked, as well as not being sure that they have the skills that it takes to serve, all is reasons why they might not seek appointment. We think this question of the why of underrepresentation is an important one to continue investigating through future research. Next slide. So that being said, there are some steps that cities and counties can take to improve representation on appointed boards. Broadly, these steps will improve the transparency of local board activities and processes, and they can address some of the barriers that might hinder women from applying and serving. So we're recommending that cities and counties publish comprehensive lists of boards on their government websites, as well as board meeting agendas, dates, and minutes. That cities and counties disseminate some more information about the appointments process itself, make that process of applying more transparent. It's always a good idea to explicitly invite and encourage women to apply, and to consider how different factors like the time you're meeting, the place you're meeting, and maybe whether or not there's childcare available might be adjusted to better accommodate women's participation. Next slide. And if you're here as an individual in our audience today, there are things you can do as well. And we encourage everybody here to investigate board representation in your own town, your own city and county. Most, or at least many, municipal and county websites will have this board information available. And if they don't, let them know that that's what you would like to see. Tell your local elected officials how much you value reflective representation. Advocate for transparency in your local government's appointments process. And consider applying to serve on a board where you live, and encouraging women in your life to seek appointment. Next slide. There's plenty of avenues here for future research that we're excited to undertake going forward with United We. There's opportunity to do some more comprehensive analysis in multiple states, like we've done in Kansas and Missouri, and to continue to explore the reasons why women are underrepresented on appointed boards, as well as to capture the experiences of women who have served. We think all of these research avenues would certainly enrich our understanding of what it takes to achieve reflective representation and to shore up that responsiveness and trust that we have in local government. With that, I will turn that back to you, Wendy. Thanks.
Thank you, Amy and Tim. We really appreciate your work on this important topic. And as you know, our audience is hearing, this research highlights the need and opportunity to inspire more women to engage in civic leadership. I think what I'm most excited about for United We is that we are starting to get some baseline data that can really help us start to measure progress across the country as we move forward with this initiative. This data underlines the efforts to increase women on boards and commissions across the nation through our Appointments Project. And I'm proud to announce that our Appointments Project is celebrating its 10th anniversary this year. It'll officially be next month in April. And today, more than 200 women have been appointed through our program. We have some of our appointees joining us today. So thank you for being a part of the Appointments Project and for your service. Our research also shows women like to be asked to serve, as Amy mentioned. So today, if you aren't serving in this capacity, please think about this. I ask each of you on this webinar to consider applying for a board or commission. Or if you're joining and it may not be a right time for you, encourage someone else that you know to raise their hand and share their experiences in their community. Your voice is needed. Learn more about serving at united-we.org/AP-overview. And I know the team will be dropping that link in the chat for you. I also ask that you read and share this research. We want this report to be distributed far and wide. The full report is available now to download from unitedwe.org. Together, by sharing this research, we can educate others and inspire more women to lead in our communities. As mentioned in the introduction, today we are delighted to have with us Deprice Taylor, who has served on the Kansas City Board of Commissioners for Parks and Recreation since 2023. Deprice was born and raised in Detroit, Michigan, and has more than a decade of experience in nonprofit leadership and community stakeholder collaboration, and currently serves as the Executive Director of Community Relations for the Kansas City Current, which is a professional women's soccer team. And as I mentioned in the intro, in case you joined us a little late, Kansas City the Current just opened the first women's stadium in the world for a professional sports team right here in Kansas City, and had their game and they won on Saturday. So Caprice, congratulations again. We'd love to hear more about your personal journey to civic engagement, what motivated you, and what your board experience has been like. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Caprice.
Well, thank you, Wendy. First of all, good morning, everyone. Wendy, I just want to thank you for the opportunity to be here today and to present a little bit of my story, a little bit of my journey, a little bit of my testimony, and the work that you do in amplifying the voices of women and the representation on boards and commission. My voice is a little gone, if you all can't tell, and that is because I have been living the dream, honestly. As Wendy mentioned, I am the Executive Director of Community Relations for the Kansas City Current, the women's professional soccer team here in Kansas City, and we just opened CPKC Stadium on Saturday, home of the very first stadium purpose-built for a women's professional sports team. And I get chills and emotional when I just think about even just saying that. So thank you all for allowing me to share just a little bit of my testimony with you all today. My story starts in Detroit, and I think that's so important because it's the foundation of who I am, it's the foundation of my lived experiences. But it all started with my grandmother, who taught me the purpose of community and the importance of community. Growing up in the environment and the circumstances in which I did, those things were very important to have the resources and access available to me, becoming the first in my family to graduate college and do some other things as well. So I'm very proud, but I'm very fortunate and grateful and blessed to have had a foundation like my grandmother who set me on this path today. My experience in serving has always been in nonprofit. It's been something that I've just done naturally because I wouldn't be here without those folks, without those resources who have propelled me to this position right now here in Kansas City. I'm not from Kansas City, as I stated, but when I moved here in 2016, 2017, I needed to find home. I needed to build relationships. I knew that community was the only way that I would feel safe. When we talk about inclusion, it's a matter of feeling safe and having a sense of belonging. And so a good friend of mine invited me to a networking collaboration event and with the city. I think Mayor Lucas helped put that on as well. And going into it, I have to be honest, I was very apprehensive. You know, a lot of times when we go to networking events, it's for someone who is a real relationship builder, someone who understands that relationships are the greatest wealth. I wanted to make real contact with people. That was quickly eliminated when I walked through the door. And I say it was quickly eliminated because I saw women that looked like me. I saw women of all backgrounds. I saw women of all demographics. I saw women of all economic statuses. And that intimidation eased just a little bit. And I was able to talk to them about their experiences. I was able to ask them questions. Did you need to know certain things? Did you have to have a certain degree? Did you have to be an executive leader in a corporation? And none of those things were true. I was able to bring my own lived experience and have a seat at the table and be able to really make a difference in the community that I lived in. And so some of the things that I've been able to do just by serving on the Parks and Rec board, I get emotional when I just think about, if you're familiar with Kansas City and take Swope Pool, for example. This was a pool where Black African Americans were not able to swim in the 1950s. I had a board meeting last night where 60% of the board are women, but I had a board meeting last night and I'm sitting at that table, a public hearing, and get to talk about how we're gonna renovate Swope Pool. And I think, and that gives me chills. My fiance and I just bought our first home, the first in our families to do so, but that home is right near Kessler Park. And that park is so historic when you think about Kansas City. And so I get to really have an impact in the things that I get to do. And I'm just very blessed to have that opportunity. I could talk for a while about the work that I get to do. When I think about even my role just with Kansas City Current and the community, I'm here. I'm here in this role because of opportunities that existed for a kid like me. And so I'll leave you all with this. I know my time is limited and there's an opportunity to ask some questions, but I've been reading this book by Dr. Anita Phillips, and she's a trauma therapist. And until I read her definition of purpose, I always tried to figure out, am I in my purpose? Am I living my purpose? Well, she defines purpose as the gift you offer to meet a need in the community that you live in. Purpose is productive. Purpose is relational. And it's about the service to those around you. And so when I first started, I talked about how I'm living a dream, but the truth is I'm living in my purpose right now. And so I hope that if there's someone on this call who has considered joining the board, really, really think about that, because you have the ability to make an impact for community, but for women. And for women who look like me and other minority women. So I'll leave it there. I know there'll probably be some questions, but thank you all for your time. And I'm just honored and so blessed to be able to share my story and a little bit of my testimony.
Thank you, DePriest. Thank you for your leadership and for your service and for raising your hand to serve in this capacity. And DePriest's story is not uncommon all across the country. So thank you again. We want to open this up now for questions and answers. Feel comfortable in dropping them in the chat for DePriest, for Amy, for Tim, anything regarding the research. We'd love to have a conversation here. But I have received a couple of questions in advance, and the first question is directed to Amy and Tim, our researchers. So by looking at those 4 boards, do you feel this is a good representation of what's happening in cities across America and at all boards and commissions? And I know you referenced this at the top of the opening, but just to, summarize again, the focus of the 4 boards.
Sure, Tim, why don't you address that?
Yeah, I think what we wanted to do first and foremost was, this was, as we said, the first national study, and we wanted to make sure that we had a national data set that was sort of consistent throughout. And as mentioned, local government, there's just, I think when we looked at, maybe it was New York City, or there were upwards of 70 boards, and they're just very different types. And because of what we had seen in the earlier studies, that the representation varied by board type, we thought it was important to let's just start with a certain fixed number of predefined boards, and then we know that our data set is consistent. And so what did we look at? We looked at the ones that I mentioned, which were very central, very powerful. And then we threw in the library one because it had been shown to be, in prior research, the only kind that was had more women than men serving on it broadly in the studies that were done. So I think you could reasonably ask, is this pattern going to hold true for every type of board? And I think the answer is probably no. We've already seen some variation. And so if we were to pick another kind of board, then we might find that, I don't know that they would land on that 39%, because even in this study, we saw some variation. But I will say, I've never seen either in data or any prior bit of research, anything that would suggest that by changing the types of boards that we picked, or looking at additional boards, we would find that actually no, women are overrepresented. So I think it's a very reasonable first step. I think it would be great to expand the research to do more types of boards nationally, but I don't expect that the results would change very markedly if we were to do so.
Great, thank you, Tim. And just, to recap for everyone, hearing the research, hearing DePriest's story, the Appointments Project is an intervention to really support the need, why we need an Appointments Project based on the data of getting women appointed to boards and commissions. And one thing to celebrate here in Women's History Month in the city of Kansas City, Missouri, where we actually launched the Appointments Project under former Mayor Sly James and now under the leadership of Mayor Quentin Lucas, we have changed that composition. So when we started the Appointments Project in the city of Kansas City, Missouri, the representation was around 32, 33%, and today it's over 51% representation of women on boards and commissions. So the intervention is a proof point that it works and is a solution. So we've had a couple of questions. Feel comfortable dropping them in the chat. I think one follow-up question for the research team, just in terms of the question around race. We focused on that with the Missouri research study, but just the challenge, and just would love to hear from a researcher's perspective about why we haven't been able to include or determine race in this particular research study.
Sure, happy to address that. Our algorithms that we use rely on first names to predict gender. And there's a pretty good set of consistency between a person's first name and, or we see patterns over time between gender and name. It's less consistent when it comes to race, and those particular types of statistical tools aren't sensitive enough to really do that analysis at the city level yet. But we do agree that looking at all kinds of representation is really important, and there's a lot of opportunity with methods potentially like survey-based methods where people can self-identify with their racial and ethnic identity that may be able to help give us a better understanding of reflective representation when it comes to race and ethnicity.
Thank you, Amy. There's a question from Emily. She manages Matchboard, the web app for Columbia, South Carolina, and a dozen other local governments in South Carolina to use and to manage their boards and commissions. I'm curious which boards you reviewed for Columbia.
Yeah, hi, Emily. You can find a list of all of the boards that were a part of our data set in the appendix of the report. So I don't have those off the top of my head, but they are published.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Amy. This is from Chelsea for everyone. Would love for this group to elaborate on the connections between decisions made by local power boards and government policies that impact women's lives. I think people are likely more familiar with government policy decisions, and as we look to encourage more local board participation, drawing impact connections between the familiar and unknown is important. Amy, Tim?
Yeah, Tim, I wonder if you want to speak to that childcare example that you mentioned earlier.
Sure. Yeah, I think this is actually, I think, part of one of the broader things that United We is trying to do, which is to bring awareness and educate folks about the things that local government are doing. It does often fly under the radar. We know our media environment has become more and more national, and people are very familiar with what the federal government is doing. And oftentimes those very same people have no idea what's going on locally. And that's for a whole host of reasons. But absolutely, these boards and commissions are making decisions that affect, they affect the traffic in your city. They affect whether or not new stores do open or do not open. They affect the degree to which new businesses that might hire employees locally come into the city or not. And then in the example that I mentioned that Amy just mentioned, more recently, planning and zoning boards in some states have been shown to be one of the challenges to providing adequate childcare. And we know that is just, I bring that one up simply because that's an extremely current topic that I think lots of people feel the challenge of not being able to find adequate childcare. And the way that local planning and zoning boards are connected to that is in some states, planning and zoning boards have been found to be denying permission for childcare businesses to open because of either outdated zoning codes or NIMBYism or things like that. And so, again, there's just some states have actually passed laws to stop local planning and zoning boards from doing that, but that's another conversation. But the ways in which these boards connect to just the real concrete experience of our lives is just kind of endless. So yeah.
Thank you, Tim. And yes, just to underscore, the economic development for women is a priority for United We, and entrepreneurship, but childcare certainly are one of our top 6 policy priorities for the organization. This is a question for DePriest. DePriest, for when you sought out the board for Parks and Recreation, were there specific requirements, and did you have all of the requirements that you needed? How did you navigate that process?
Yeah, Wendy, no, that's a great question. And I think sometimes what deters us from seeking these positions is that we think that there are a lot of requirements. I'll tell you, the only requirement for me was that I lived in Kansas City. There wasn't a limit of where my expertise was or if I even attended college. It was a matter of me living in Kansas City. And I would add to that, really being passionate about what's happening in Kansas City. We talk about the economic development. The World Cup is coming here in 2026. We KCPKC Stadium, all of the other economic development that's happening in Kansas City. You have to be really passionate about it. And I'm really passionate about that. I moved here and didn't know anyone. But this city has shown me an abundance of love and support. So why wouldn't I want to give that back? I talked about buying a home, and we just moved back into the city from South Kansas City. And that was very important for us, especially being on a board as large and as historic as Kansas City Parks and Rec, over 200 parks, over 115 playgrounds, 10 community centers, acres and acres and acres of land. The thing was that I wanted to make sure that we were close and that impact was seen, and that we were very committed and dedicated to this city. And so one of the things that I did once I was on the board, my first board that I was on Visit KC. So you're talking about a really huge board that really kind of sets the stage for the economic development and tourism of the city. And so I went to resources provided by United We and the Appointments Project and really looked at what those resources were. I was able to connect with other women who held these board positions and ask questions. What are some things that I should be looking at? And I've been able to learn so much, understanding how the city's taxes are used and where they're going. And then being able to explain that to other people, because the thing is that we think we know because what's in the news and what's in the media, but that's not the way it works. There's a deeper level of how taxes are used and how things actually are impacted within the city.
Thank you, Deprice. Question from Paul. Your data shows that women's representation in this dimension of local government is much higher than in national and electoral levels. Could this be part of the reason that people have greater trust in local government? Question to Amy and Tim.
Great question. And in a word, absolutely. It's very interesting to us that while we overall are seeing that, yes, women's representation in local government is not reflected, that there is underrepresentation, it's not as severe or as wide or as significant, I suppose, in some ways as that elected underrepresentation on the slide that we showed earlier in our presentation, with women in the Senate and the US House being at right around 25 and 29%. So absolutely, we know that there's a connection between the reflectiveness of government and its responsiveness, and then subsequently the public's trust. And that's ever the more reason why we think that these numbers should be increased and as a way to shore up our trust in government.
Great, thank you, Amy. Tim, anything to add?
No, I think Amy covered it.
Okay, thank you. Okay, from Sadie, Deprice, your book, the name of the book that you mentioned, can you just repeat the title?
Called The Garden Within by Dr. Anita Phillips. She has an incredible podcast that she did with Oprah on YouTube. I advise everyone to check it out. So it's beautiful.
Fantastic, that's great. Any final questions to drop into the chat? Anything else that's on your mind? I think this question can be directed to Deprice. So the Parks and Recreation Board, you mentioned the pool, but any other insights or contributions you have been a part of since serving on the commission?
Sorry, trying to get off mute. You would think after 3 years, know how to do that, 3 or 4 years. You know what? I have been a part of some incredible projects. Just yesterday, where CPKC Stadium is on the riverfront, there is a street, Berkeley Parkway, but half of that street is Grand Boulevard. And we approved to go into a name change for that stadium on that street. And I get to be a part of that. I get to be a part of rebuilding the Paseo steps and making that a community asset. I get to be a part of just things that are going to contribute to not just my personal legacy and what I've been able to achieve, but what it means for the city. We get to have an impact on the quality of lifestyle for so many people that use our parks, that use our trails, that use our boulevards. And just very fortunate to be able to be a part of that.
Great, thank you, Depreece. Well, this concludes our presentation. If there aren't any final questions, we'll wrap up here, but I want to thank each of you for joining us today. The title of this research study is called Out of Balance. And again, I think you can tell this research really proves that we have some work to do for representation in our communities on boards and commissions at the municipal level. You can learn more by accessing the full report, which is being released today on our website, and on the slide you can see it's at unitedwe.org/research. I want to thank Amy and Tim for their great work and the research team for putting this report together. And I want to thank Depreece for joining us today to share her civic journey with us and to talk further about some of the key decisions that she's made for the city of Kansas City, Missouri on the Parks and Recreation Board. Thank you all for joining us today, and please enjoy the rest of Women's History Month. Have a great day.